Hi everyone, and welcome to today's chat. My name is Trinia. I'm a team member here at Understood, and today we're going to be talking about dyslexia and self-esteem. And this is a super important topic. I know myself as a former teacher at the high school level, I definitely had a lot of kids struggling with self-esteem because they were struggling with their academics. And a lot of times this was because of dyslexia or another learning disability. And so I'm really excited for this topic today, and I'm super excited to have Dr. Roberto Olivardia joining us. Hi, Roberto. How are you?
I'm doing great, Trinia. It's great to be here.
Great. Do you want to take just a minute to introduce yourself to our viewers?
Sure. My name is Dr. Roberto Olivardia. I'm a clinical psychologist and lecturer in the Department of Psychiatry at Harvard Medical School. And I have a private practice in Lexington, Massachusetts, where I specialize in the treatment of ADHD as well as OCD and work with lots of kids with learning disabilities and the issues that can come along with that.
Thank you. And I just want to let our viewers know that today's video chat is going to be a little bit different from our typical ones. We are doing a webinar today, and Roberto and the Understood team have worked on putting together some resources and information to hopefully answer a lot of the questions that parents might already be thinking. But if you're out there and you do have a burning question that you want to ask and it doesn't get answered throughout this webinar, we are doing a short Q&A at the end of the webinar. So we'll have about 45 minutes of presentation and then about 15 minutes at the end where we will do a Q&A with Roberto. So if you have a question, go ahead and type it in the comments. It's usually helpful if you can give us the age or the grade level of your child so we can give a more targeted response. But with that said, I'm going to pass it over to Roberto. And Roberto, if you have your screen ready, we will turn it over to you to present your slides.
Great. Thank you very much. So also I want to let people know that other than coming from this as a professional, I'm also coming from this as a parent and very much are speaking to other parents. I have an 8th grader, a 14-year-old son who has dyslexia and ADHD, actually graduated middle school today. So I'm feeling a bit emotional. So a lot of these slides are going to be very, very appropriate and relevant for a lot of what the joy that I'm feeling today towards my son. So what is self-esteem? When we really think about it, we hear this, and of course we want it for our children, but what do we actually mean by that when we break it down? Basically what self-esteem is the feeling of worth that you feel that you have, how much you feel that you can contribute to your world, to your community, to your friendships, to your family, to just everything around you. How much value do you feel you have in terms of good things about you that other people see, that you see in yourself, that you feel is very necessary and you make impact in the world. And part of self-esteem is not feeling like you have weaknesses, but more having an acceptance of what comes naturally to you and what you might work really hard for in terms of your strengths, but also things that might not come so easy to you, but you can work through despite the fact that initially they might be weaknesses. Now, when we think about dyslexia, I know for me as a parent, when my son was diagnosed at 6, I'm very well aware of the heritability and genetics of ADHD and dyslexia. So we did a full neuropsych assessment when my son was in kindergarten. And when he was diagnosed with pretty severe dyslexia, my first thought was not so much about his remediation of reading. I felt, okay, we'll work on that. Of course, we're going to work on that. My number one thought is he can never think that he's stupid or dumb, because he's not. And that's going to be the thing that's going to really impact him. And unfortunately, through my clinical work, through advocacy work that both me and my son do, and through the research, shows that there is a social emotional impact for a lot of kids who struggle with dyslexia. Unfortunately, they do feel like they're stupid or dumb. They feel less than. They feel inferior to their peers in terms of learning learning and academics. And they have poor self-esteem, which means they don't feel they have as much to contribute or as much value in the world around them. And as a result of that, if you don't think that you have much value or worth, then why bother connecting with other people? So a lot of these kids will end up socially isolating themselves and sometimes be targets for bullies, and can also sometimes deal with those feelings of inferiority by bullying others. I remember when I was in 8th grade, there was a young man in my class who was kept back 3 times, which hopefully would never happen today. I'm sure somewhere it does, but he clearly had learning issues and learning disabilities. And he was supposed to be an 11th grader, and he's in 8th grade. And as a result of that, became quite a bully to other people, but really because of his own feelings of inferiority. It's very easy to feel different when you have a learning difference like dyslexia. Now, in addition to all of that, when you feel that way, it causes an inordinate amount of stress. That imagine going to your job every day, knowing you're going to be stressed out, knowing that you're going to be subpar or feel inadequate. It can be incredibly stressful for these kids. And this is their job. School is their job until they graduate high school and whatever post-education they do. As a result, some kids don't know how to deal with that stress, and it may come out in somatic complaints, stomach aches, migraine headaches, irritable bowel syndrome, headaches, just fatigue. Lots of kids with dyslexia will develop issues around anxiety, where why bother going to school if I'm just going to fail, if I'm not getting what I'm supposed to be getting. So you'll see sometimes school refusal behavior. And in fact, studies of kids who engage in school refusal, you'll see a very high rate of kids with diagnosed or undiagnosed learning disabilities. And when not properly intervened, which I'll talk about later, these kids can face a risk of dropping out of school. In addition to anxiety is depression. Again, when you think about depression, you think sort of people who feel very disconnected from their feelings. They feel worthless. Feeling worthless is a symptom of depression. And we know that can be very applicable to a lot of students who struggle with dyslexia. And as a result of that, kids with learning disabilities can have a learned helplessness feeling. And what that means is that they basically say, well, nothing I do matters. And if I have to put in all of this work and I'm only getting a quarter of the feedback back, what's the point? I might as well not do anything. And frankly, do we blame them if they're not getting the proper education, if they're not getting proper support? How do we not feel that way? Again, kids who struggle with this may deal with those feelings, the anxiety and the depression, through conduct or behavioral problems or in anger management issues. A lot of times, when I've done talks with teachers, I tell them a lot of times we have to be aware that when a kid is acting out, that's usually a sign that there's something not going well for that child. So it's, what is this person going through versus, oh my gosh, this person is, out of control. It's more that something internal is not doing well. There is research on looking at this relationship of dyslexia and self-esteem. And one thing that is very evident is that self-esteem for kids with learning differences can worsen due to a phenomenon known as the Matthew effect. So the Matthew effect is basically, it's an economic term that refers to basically that the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. If you are wealthy and you can afford, let's say, better medical resources and better educational resources, then you're exponentially going to rise in terms of socioeconomic status and ability to do things because of those opportunities. If you are in poverty, you don't have the ability to access those resources, which makes it much more difficult to move forward. Now, with reading, what's very important, and of course, every parent I'm sure out there can relate to this, is that there's a big difference between making progress and having effective progress. Now, the purple line refers to the neurotypical reader that we're reading. It might be easy to them. They practice reading. It might even be fun. And lots of practice leads to lots of progress, and they're getting the right instruction. They're going to make a lot of progress. The blue line represents the kid with dyslexia who might be making progress, quote unquote, meaning they're moving forward. But as you can see, because reading is difficult, if they're not getting the proper instruction or support, they're not going to want to read, and they avoid practicing, and less practice leads to less progress. And over the grades, as reading becomes more intricate, as vocabulary becomes more complex, that you're going to have that individual not even come close to where they need to be in terms of the neurotypical readers. So as that blue line, yes, it's moving forward, but as parents, we always have to say, is this effective progress? Because there's a gap here. They're making progress for them, but they're not even close to where they need to be. In research, Humphrey in 2002 did a study where he compared different groups of children. One were kids with dyslexia who were in mainstream classes. The second group were kids with dyslexia in a learning disability program. So this was a program that really had empirically validated remediation and work on their reading. And kids, what we call a control group, so children who did not have a dyslexia diagnosis. And he found, when looking at various indices, that both of the dyslexic groups had endorsed more sort of timid personality traits and tended to be very avoidant of stress, more so than the control group. But what's interesting is that when he looked at self-esteem, that they found that the lowest self-esteem group were the dyslexic kids in the mainstream placement. And in fact, there was no difference in self-esteem between the children without dyslexia and the ones with dyslexia who were in a learning difference program, a program that very much supported the kind of instruction that they needed to do. Now, in addition, Humphrey and Mullins found in a qualitative study that half of children with dyslexia in their sample reported being bullied or teased. Almost a third of them felt stupid or lazy. Almost a third of them felt less intelligent than their peers. Half of them would swap places with someone else. And these are significantly different than the kids who do not have dyslexia. And what's also striking is the children with dyslexia, even when they were successful, often attributed their success to external factors versus internal factors, what we call having an external locus of control. Oh, I had just great teachers, which may be true. However, when they're saying that, they're dismissing the strength and the resilience and the work that they did to achieve that. I had great teachers. Oh, I was just lucky. Oh, I'm just an easy test taker. I have worked with children, adolescents, young adults in college who are amazing students, who are incredibly bright, who also have dyslexia, and despite the fact that they might have a 4.0 GPA, still say to themselves, "Well, I'm just lucky," as opposed to really recognizing the intellectual capacity that they possess and the work that they do to fulfill that. So they have what's called a very poor locus of control. Now, Glazard in 2010 looked at what are factors that might go against self-esteem promotion in kids with dyslexia. And the factors that were recognized: teachers who were resistant to a dyslexia diagnosis, peers having very negative peer experiences. And what's important about this is that having very negative peer experiences can sometimes negate the positive influences from parents. Now, that's not to say that we have no impact and we have no influence. However, at certain age groups, particularly in middle school, that peer relationships are extremely important, and the messaging that they get from peers. So surrounding yourself with very affirming individuals as a peer group is very, very important for any child, but especially for those with learning differences. So positive peer relationships can also be protective factors. So even for children, let's say, who have a dyslexia diagnosis, who might not be getting the kind of effective instruction that they need, may still sometimes report good self-esteem if they have very positive peer relationships. So I say to parents, it's very important, invest in finding, peers that your son or daughter can connect with, invest that time and energy. It can really go a long way. And it may seem like it's not academically oriented, but it actually very much will promote their self-esteem in a way that will help them in a lot of different ways. Another factor that Glazard identified as a negative influence to self-esteem is known as concealment, which is this idea of the dyslexia being very secretive, very shameful, not revealing it, not talking about it, and really feeling like this was something that needs to be hidden from other people, very shameful part of their identity. So when you see concealment, you'll often see that goes against self-esteem. Also, these were individuals who, often will find themselves feeling like they're always failing. And what I always understand is the kind of collateral damage of poor self-esteem is, regardless of what the etiology, the cause of it is, that when you are someone who fails all the time, and again, we know, all of us in the understood community know, that these children have amazing potential and intellectual capacity, but from their perspective, if they're failing, they don't think, oh, this school or this instruction might not be effective for me, or I need to get more Wilson one-on-one or Orton Gillingham. They don't understand that. They just see that they're failing. And when you are a child that fails all the time, it's very easy to stop dreaming and to stop wishing for things, and you abandon that. And this is a part of my practice of children that I see who have ADHD, who have learning differences, who really, they come to my office because they're feeling very down and depressed. Their spirit for learning evaporates despite having a very enthusiastic sense of learning. A lot of kids I work with, and I can relate to this as someone with ADHD myself, that said, will often say something to the effect of, I love learning. It's just school gets in the way of that. And I could very much, I said something very similar when I was younger. But when you feel ineffective, when you feel worthless, you start to feel irrelevant. And as a result, it's very easy to feel unlovable. So I'm painting this portrait that certainly can sound very negative and very pessimistic. However, does this mean that being dyslexic is just a road to poor negative self-esteem? Is it hazardous to your mental health? Well, the answer is actually no, that being dyslexic in and of itself is not hazardous to your health. It does not have to be this way. So everything that I just presented, this is the state of affairs for a lot of children with dyslexia, but this is not a given. Should not be the default. And that's why I'm so happy to be here and proud to be here, and very much support everything Understood does, because what we're here to do is to change that script, is to flip that. And so part of how we begin to change that is we have to have certain coping skills that we want to equip our children with. We want to have ways of helping them promote a strong identity, and with having a dyslexia, I wouldn't even say despite having dyslexia, with having a dyslexia diagnosis. And so I put these in four main categories that I call the COPE model. One, the C, is for creating a healthy philosophy about emotions. O, operating a shame-free, judgment-free mindset. P, promoting self-esteem and self-advocacy. And E, evidence-based instruction. And I'm going to go briefly through these four. So first, we want to create in our children a healthy philosophy about emotions. A lot of the children that I work with, what is often problematic for them is that they're feeling a lot of things, but they don't feel either that they have permission to feel that, or they find it so intolerable to feel that they will find themselves suppressing that emotion. They want to avoid it. They don't want to think about it. And we need to feel our emotions in order to cope with them, much in the way that I tell my patients that in order to get the flu shot, we're injecting a kind of little bit of the flu in our arm in order to build an immunity to it. It's similar. No one wants to be thinking about how they're sad or how they're angry. However, in order to get through that, in order to move through it, we have to connect to it. We have to feel it. However, if we allow ourselves to do that, we're in more control of how that emotion basically goes from that moment on. There is tremendous energy in suppressing our emotions, tremendous. In fact, when we think about things like depression, for example, or rage, those are not emotions. Depression and rage, I see, as often the result of when we are suppressing a lot of emotion. We cannot just numb ourselves from negative feelings and avail ourselves of the positive feelings. It's like those holiday lights where when one bulb burns, then all of those bulbs are going to burn. So if you try to numb yourself from feeling negative feelings, you're going to end up numbing yourself from even the positive ones. And then you have sort of this flatness or this nothingness. So when we suppress an emotion, we're creating an uncontrollable expression of that emotion. Panic attacks, for example, really are someone who is getting anxious about getting anxious. Depression is often described as the absence of emotion. Somebody who might have been so sad or so angry and just couldn't really feel or connect to that feeling, and basically the fuse just blows and then they feel nothingness. Rage is often when we're feeling angry or agitated or anxious or frustrated, and we're just trying to hold it in, and it's like that beach ball that we're putting to the bottom of the ocean floor. When we release it, it's going to pop up like a geyser. That's what rage is. So we want to basically tell our kids, feel these emotions. Maybe it's easier to feel them using music or writing or sports, but we need to get those emotions out. We want to operate a shame-free, judgment-free mindset. A lot of these kids who struggle with dyslexia will feel shame, and shame can be a very corrosive emotion because it's feeling bad about not something you did, as in the case of guilt. It's feeling bad for something that you feel, or someone that you feel you are, or who you think you are. And a lot of these kids feel, again, that they are worthless, that they are stupid, and they feel a lot of shame from that. And that can lead to a lot of numbing, avoidance, and withdrawal. I treat a lot of adolescents who sometimes engage in very risky behavior, self-harm behaviors, eating disorders, substance abuse, and of which one of the leading contributing factors has been how they have felt about themselves by having dyslexia. So when we suppress ourselves, we are suppressing our emotions, and we end up suppressing ourselves. It becomes this feedback loop. So the goal is to be authentic and to feel ourselves in a very authentic way. So how do we do that? Well, we want to promote self-esteem and self-advocacy, and through three main ways: early identification, embracing the dyslexia label, and acknowledging positive features of dyslexia. So early identification. Now, I can't stress enough, and this is something that parents, schools, our culture, the education field, we all have to continue sort of working together and really getting these kids identified as early as possible, and spreading continued awareness, because a lot of times, certainly parents that I've spoken to that I can completely understand, were sometimes told like, oh, they'll catch up. They're reading. Yeah, every kid, not every kid's a fast reader. They'll catch up. They'll catch up. And parents will say to me, I feel so bad, like I failed my child because my gut was telling me something was wrong. And I tell them, you did not. We all do the best we can, and we all have the best intentions. But there's no manual, unless you start talking to other parents who have children with learning differences to know what to do all the time. I recognize fully the privilege that I have in relation, with my son's dyslexia, being in a field where I specialize in this. I'm aware of my own ADHD and learning differences I had as a child. I had the financial resources to get him the full neuropsych battery in kindergarten. So there is a privilege that comes along with that. And so what we want to do is keep putting the word out there for parents that might not otherwise know. You don't know what you don't know. So what we do know, however, is research shows that kids who are identified earlier actually have similar global self-esteem as non-dyslexic students, and that early identified students have a higher sense of control and confidence. Now, this is what's interesting, is that a lot of times I'll have parents say, oh, yes, my kid has dyslexia, but I'm afraid to use that word. I don't like the D word. I don't want them feeling like they're different. And I say to them, I get that. I totally understand that. We just don't want our children to have to struggle. We don't want our children to struggle through things that are just going to be muddy and feel unnecessary. However, we need to have, there's nothing inherently shameful about the word. There's nothing inherently bad about dyslexia. And in fact, studies support this, that when Glazard interviewed children with dyslexia, found that 90% felt positive about the word dyslexia. They actually felt that there was a positivity associated with that word. They felt an ownership of the label. And they surmised, quote, early diagnosis of dyslexia is essential for creating a positive self-image. Why? Well, the word is very validating. Now, I know as someone, who, again, have I have ADHD, I have issues as well with reading, that when I continue to hear research about the ADHD brain, about, the dyslexic brains, I feel this incredible sense of validation of, oh, wow, isn't this cool that there are scientific journals that are devoted basically to how my brain works. And I think that's how we should look at it, that how fortunate that we have this field of study that just helps us understand ourselves. And it is validating. It doesn't mean that, these children wouldn't sometimes trade not having dyslexia, but they don't have to feel bad about it. And they have to also, once you have a term, once you have a word, you're not alone. You know that there are many other people out there, because if they have a name for it and there's certain remediations and interventions for it, and there are journals devoted to it, and there are associations that are devoted to it, there are platforms like Understood that are devoted, well, clearly there's a lot of people out there. And that alone is very, very powerful. So there is nothing wrong with having that dyslexia term. In addition, is scientific data. I break down a lot of scientific data to even the youngest kids that I work with dyslexia and put it into their language. And they take it in like bread and butter. They are very eager to hear about it. They're very eager to see pictures that I might show them of dyslexic brains and how they might process words in a different way than a non-dyslexic brain. It just makes it just so much more concrete for them. So we can translate that scientific data to even the youngest of people. We just have to obviously put it in age-appropriate language. But I think a lot of times we as parents, and certainly anyone who is over the age of 30, when we were young, when I was young, that first of all, there were very few people that were even identified, with dyslexia back then. I do remember an after-school special in the 80s where a kid read his letters backwards, and that's what everyone thought dyslexia was. But, a lot of kids who might, and a lot of parents, and we know this is heritable, so a lot of kids who have dyslexia will often have a parent with dyslexia, that they might be coming from their own experiences, which might have been very poor in terms of what was done for them. We're living in a totally different time now where there are many more resources and much more knowledge and much less stigma. We're not 100% there yet, but there is much less stigma around it. But more importantly, we want to embrace this label because if we do not define the term for them, someone else will. And that other person who does it may not do it correctly. They may do it with ignorance. They may do it in a bullying fashion. They may do it by defining it as dumb. And once that imprint is there, we then have to undo that in order to convince our child that, no, that person who told you about dyslexia, that's wrong, that's incorrect. We want to beat them to the punch. We want to sort of be the first ones to say, this is it, this is what you have, this is what it's called, and there is nothing wrong with it. However, it does mean we have to do things a little bit differently than kids who don't have dyslexia. And there'll be changes maybe in how the classroom or how school might work. There are going to be things you do have to work maybe extra hard than other people will, but this doesn't have to hold you back in life. So we have to kind of do the work and sort of train ourselves now to get to work through this. When my son was diagnosed at 6, I went on Amazon and I just Googled dyslexia books for kids, and I ordered all of them. And there weren't that many, so I think it was less than a dozen. But I just ordered them, and I read them all to him. And it was very helpful, again, to see in a book, in a children's book, other kids who had issues with this and who struggled with it and who persevered with it. Watch YouTube videos about dyslexia. Actually, a big shout out to Understood, because my son is a fan of Shark Tank, which I'll talk about a little bit later. But one of the entrepreneurs on Shark Tank, Damon Johns, he has dyslexia, and he and his mother did these videos that we actually saw and Understood, of them just having this mother-son conversation about Damon's dyslexia. And it was very powerful for my son, who just respected all of the sharks on Shark Tank, wants to be a shark on Shark Tank, and to think, wow, like, who knew? But really, why would we know? A lot of times, even unintentionally, sometimes people are like, oh, I didn't know your son is dyslexic. He speaks so well, or he has such a good vocabulary, or he's so smart. I'm like, yeah, you could be all of those things and have dyslexia. Like, there's no reason that you wouldn't know, that you should know, unless perhaps, you see the person's spelling or something like that. But those videos were extraordinarily helpful. And so whatever your child is into, if they're into athletics, find a sports star that has dyslexia who talks about it or writes about it. If they're into music, find a musician. If they're into science, find a biologist. There are people in all facets of our community that who have dyslexia and who have achieved very great things. Now, one of the things that I sort of coined, when my son was diagnosed, and I said to my wife, I'm like, okay, we just have to protect his self-esteem. I said, IEP will figure out the individualized education plan. This kid needs an IPP. And at the time, I called it an ignorance preparation plan. But that almost sounded too negative now. So I give parents the choice whether they want to call it that or an identity promotion plan. But I was like, we have to prepare him that there is a lot of ignorance around this, that a lot of people will not understand this and don't understand this. So I sat with him, and again, your child best. You use it in what age-appropriate language makes sense for your son or daughter. And I said to him, this thing, dyslexia, I said, and, ADHD is something that's been talked about in our house for a long time. We're sort of an ADD family. And I said, so there are going to be things that are going to be different. But I want you to know a lot of people do not know what this is and don't understand it. So I'm going to tell you what it is, but there are going to be a lot of people that really might have very wrong information about it. I said there are going to be some people that are going to be surprised that you have dyslexia. They're not going to be mean about it, but they might be like, what? You don't know how to read? How does someone not know how to read? And I role played that with him. And I said, and they might not even be, again, intentionally being mean about it. They're just going to be surprised because it's something that, again, we take for granted. Like, if you don't have an issue with reading, you sort of take it for granted that everyone could just read in certain developmental stages. So I said, and then there are some people that might be mean about it. They might call you dumb. They might call you stupid, but you're not. And we know you're not because, number one, not just because I'm your dad, but we have testing here that shows that you're not, and your teachers know, that you're not. So we did role plays. And I said, let's say that you're in a situation. He was in first grade at the time, and somebody says, oh my gosh, you can't read? How do you not know how to read the word the? That's so easy. What do you say? And we came up with different scripts and role plays, and I try to make them fun and humorous. And honestly, it's so interesting that I just came from my son's school, and he won this achievement award. And so I'm feeling emotional even now talking about this. But one of the proudest moments I've had as a dad is literally 3 weeks after we went through those role plays. I picked him up from school. He's in first grade, and he came out. He's like, "Oh, Dad, and we had a great day today, and this funny thing happened in music class." And what happened in music? And he said, "Well, we had to read these songs." And he was a non-reader in first grade. I mean, there was very, very severe dyslexia, and he said I couldn't read any of the words. And so I asked this girl next to me if I can just kind of, stand next to her while she reads them out loud. And she said, "What do you mean? Like, how do you not know how to read these words?" And he said, "I don't think she was being mean, Dad. I think she just was surprised." And he said to her, "Oh, I have this thing called dyslexia, and a lot of the sharks on Shark Tank have it, and it just means that my brain just reads a little bit differently. It makes it a little bit harder, but it's something I just have to work through." And she went, "Oh, okay." And then she read the song, and he's loved to sing really loud, and they did it. And I thought, oh my gosh, like that could have been a moment right there that could have gone a very different way. And one of many, 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 many moments. I mean, these children, again, if they're not equipped with this, they will have multiple situations where they're going to be getting messaging. So when you have that promotion plan, when you have a way of preparing your child for that, then they feel like they're inclusive, that they feel like they're part of the group. They don't have to feel so separate, but they do have to own it, and they have to accept that diagnosis. Part of it also is, and what was very important for self-esteem, in promoting healthy self-esteem, is acknowledging positive features of how dyslexic brains process and think. That this is not an illness. It's not, certainly, not a defect or anything. It's just the way the brain processes things. And that way that can make it difficult for reading can also make it very integral sometimes for very creative, out-of-the-box thinking, seeing the bigger picture of things. These individuals can be incredibly intuitive and curious and imaginative and can think in abstractions. Sometimes the things that make because you're not wedded to the letter B being a B sound in the same way that someone without dyslexia is, means that your brain can almost conjure up many different iterations and many different avenues. Now, with words, we have to get down to the letter B as a B sound because that's what it is. However, in lots of other fields and domains in life, why not think in these big picture ways and be very flexible? There are numerous studies done that looked at entrepreneurs and find there's a very high rate of entrepreneurs with dyslexia and or ADHD. And these are some of them. One of the things that I always recommend parents to do, find whatever your kid loves to do and find famous people who have dyslexia who are in that. These are 3 of the sharks on Shark Tank that all have dyslexia. Damon Johns is the one I referenced earlier. He's the one in the middle. My favorite my favorite fiction book, because I am not a fan of fiction reading personally, and this book by Agatha Christie is a book called And Then There Were None. It's also called 10 Little Indians. And that book is a very, very important book in my own academics because it was the first book in school that I actually read cover to cover. It was that I didn't skim or skip over because I either found myself so bored with it or it was difficult. And I could not put this book down. I thought it was the most amazing classic whodunit. If you haven't read it, read it. Have your kids read it. And wasn't I surprised years later to find out that Agatha Christie was dyslexic? And this is a quote: "I myself was always recognized as the slow one in the family. Writing and spelling were always terribly difficult for me. My letters were without originality." And meanwhile, she's one of probably, I believe, the most famed novelist in the world. These are other faces: actress Whoopi Goldberg, revolutionary filmmaker Steven Spielberg, Carol Greider, who is a Nobel Prize winner in physiology and medicine. She's a molecular biologist. I couldn't tell you exactly what she did because it's so scientifically complex, but it has to do with chromosomes and DNA. Tim Tebow, who's an athlete. These are all just some of the many faces of people who have dyslexia and who talk about it. Now, the E in the COPE model is evidence-based instruction. And this is something that is not something, obviously, that our children can do. This is something that needs to be given to our children. And that's what we as parents and that's what school systems have to work together to achieve. Basically, what we do know is kids with dyslexia do need a different level of instruction in reading. Things like the Wilson Program or Gillingham or Linda Mood Bell, there are many different ones. Studies show that there is not one superior to the other. It's very tailored to where your child's learning profile is, but it is going to be different than a quote-unquote mainstream student. I have this picture of birds because I always think of the analogy when we think about birds. All birds fly in different ways. Their wings might flap. Some flap in circular motions, some flap up and down, some flap very, very quickly, some flap in sort of more slower, steady paces, but they all get to their destinations if we just allow them to fly the way they're supposed to fly. And to me, that is what we need to think of our students in that same way. All of our sons and daughters and all of our students, they have wings, and we just need to support the way that they fly to provide the right environment for them to get to where they want to get to. And unfortunately, a lot of these students, their wings are clipped. Their wings are not given the access they deserve. They might have maybe access to their wings, but the environment is so muddied in ways that are not giving them the space to properly fly. In addition, I mean, why is it the assumption that every student would learn the same? It's kind of a ridiculous concept. I mean, there's nowhere else biologically that we see that. If you take the orchid, for example, that, if you take one of the most beautiful flowers and you put it in one kind of environment, it's going to die very quickly. You put it in a more supportive environment, and it just blooms and it's beautiful and smells great and is fragrant. Now, those are our dyslexic kids. Now, maybe the more mainstream kids might be more like dandelions, where they can, dandelions can be in harsh environments. They can be sort of in more supportive environments. They don't need the same kind of care as an orchid does, but that doesn't make an orchid any less of a flower. It doesn't make it any less valuable. In fact, I would say that people buy orchids. They're not going to buy dandelions for the most part, although I used to love to blow them and make wishes as a kid. So this is, again, an example that even in other biological domains that we take certain care and support of certain things like an orchid in order for that to bloom. And we need to do the same when it comes to our children. This is a quote that's been attributed to Albert Einstein. I don't know if it actually came from him, but I like it. It says, "Everybody is a genius, but if you judge a fish by its ability to climb a tree, it will live its whole life believing that it is stupid." And we don't want that to happen. For parents, also remember that your kids are trying really hard. One thing that we have to appreciate, and I know Jerry Schultz, who is another understood featured expert who's done wonderful work around the amount of stress that children with learning disabilities feel. They come home from a school day, they are exhausted. Even the ones, my son, the one-on-one instruction that he would get, he has to be on mentally in a different way than other kids, that don't have these kind of issues might have to be. And we have to appreciate that. Also, parents, seek out support for yourself as well. Find other parents who have children with learning differences. Sometimes just talk about it. Other times you don't even need to talk about it, but you can just go out for a coffee and just, enjoy the company of other people who just get it. It makes such a difference. Have fun with your child. Unfortunately, school sometimes isn't the most pleasant environment, and that's not the case for everyone. I mean, I do have kids I work with, and my son likes school, but there are a lot of kids that really don't, and we don't want it to just be about those battles of homework and instruction and reading and summer reading. We want to make sure we're having fun, because we don't want our relationship defined by this sort of tug of war that can sometimes happen. Also, most importantly, please keep an eye out for mental health issues. Again, you're going to see the frustration, you might see some anxiety, but when you start to see it in more escalating ways, when you hear your child say things things like what's life isn't worth living, when they're not going to school because they have yet another migraine, please seek help, seek therapy. The earlier, the better. Even proactively. I've had parents who sometimes they'll set up appointments for their children to see me, and their children are actually doing quite well, but they're one to prepare them, especially as the grades go on, because the demands will increase as you go through the school years. So I will stop there and open for questions.
Thank you so much, Roberto. This has been a wealth of information. Our parents have been, our families, I don't want to assume everyone's a parent, but everyone has been chatting in the chat box and offering each other resources, and it's been a really great discussion happening in our chat box as well. But we do have some questions coming in from families already. And we have some parents who are in the early stages of getting identification with dyslexia, and just trying to figure out how best to advocate at the schools. And so I guess the first question I want to start with is what the testing process looks like. And I did share some understood resources already. But can you talk to parents about how to go about getting your child tested for dyslexia? How can you find out if that's what's causing the issue?
Yes. So usually you could first, if your child's in a public school, actually get
Roberto,
testing through. Yes.
I'm going to interrupt. I think you are still sharing your screen.
Oh, okay.
And we can't see you. Oh, there you are.
Okay.
Great.
And there I am. Excellent. So I usually say, you could go one of two routes. You can ask and make a formal request for the school to do testing for your child. And there are certain tests that they will do that basically will reference certain norms that a child, let's say in second grade, typical second grader would be reading at a certain percentile, and they'll make those comparisons. Or you can seek outside testing. Now, there are some with outside testing, some are covered by insurance, some are not covered by insurance. So you want to determine that. And if that's financially prohibitive, there are some testers that are going to where your insurance can cover some of it. And they basically go through a wealth of different tasks and exercises. It's long, usually, especially if these kids also have ADHD. We'll often break it up in different sessions as opposed to 2 8-hour sessions is just going to be too long. So you kind of equip the kid. You tell them it's going to be a little bit long. You obviously talking to the tester with breaks and things like that. But it will help them, the neuropsychologist, really look at how much of this is this dyslexia? Is this ADHD? Is this anxiety? Is this OCD? There are lots of things that can sometimes complicate a learning profile, and it could be all of the above. I have, if you take just ADHD and dyslexia are highly associated. About 50% of people with ADHD have a learning disability. It could be processing speed issues. It could be, lots of other things. So once they go through that, and then they will present the results, and then you would set up a meeting with the school, and you'd say, okay, we have this testing, and you go through it. And if you want to share that with the school, which if you want services, you basically would need to share those results and say, this is what we're observing, this is what the testing has shown, and these are our concerns, and you just lay them out. And for parents that, there are a lot of advocates, that people who are in the community that can go with you to these IEP meetings. They can be very emotional. I would always feel drained after them, and this is even from very positive ones that I would have, with my son's school. But it's just there's so much you want, for your child that it's just very emotional. So having a friend, having an advocate can be very helpful.
Oh, I think that's a great idea. And we had a parent who was asking about advocating for their child at school as they're going through this IEP process and waiting to see if their child will be identified. And so do you have general tips for parents and families about how to work with teachers, how to work with the school to get the needed resources and support, even if they haven't been identified as having dyslexia yet?
Yes, that I mean usually I mean first I always say to parents, there it is a long road and we don't want to look at the school as the enemy. We don't want to look at them as our adversary because teachers, the majority of teachers are teachers because they really love kids and they want to educate, children. So we want to go in there and lay out, okay, how do we all collaborate? Because this is what I'm seeing as a parent, and share your observations. They might not see the meltdowns in school. You might have a student who never is upset and might be always smiling at school, but they come home and they have to read something and they are crying on the floor. Share those observations because the school needs to understand where you're coming from. Share what resources can we get. And I also tell parents there is a lot of resources out there, and sometimes parents don't want to be pushing. And again, I don't want to see the school as in this adversarial way. And at the same time, we are advocating for and asserting for what our children need. And so if the school's like, well, we can't do that, well, we have to make this work. We have to do this because this is the only way that my son's going to get the proper resources. So if we need to then bring someone from the outside, maybe then the school has to fund a tutor or might have to train, a teacher. It's okay to what might feel like pushing the envelope, but it's really not. It's your child is entitled to an education that is going to accommodate their ability to be able to learn. And so if that means that it might be really outside the box, I work with kids where their school day looks public school, students where their day looks very, very different, but it is getting them to what they need to get to.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. We have, this question's kind of long, but I'll preface it by saying this parent is asking about their child's teachers don't seem to understand how emotional challenges are connected with disabilities like dyslexia. And so I'll read the question. It is a little bit long. So my child is 10 and is going into 5th grade. He has dyslexia and dysgraphia and has an IEP. His teachers do not seem to understand the emotional challenges connected to his disability. Can you suggest any resources for them that might help them understand why he's avoiding his work? It says currently they think he's being defiant because he seems to be a very capable student and is just being defiant, doesn't want to do it. So do you have any resources or recommendations for this parent?
Yeah, and this is something, it pains me when I hear it because it's unfortunately very, very common, that what gets the focus is the oppositional behavior, the defiant behavior, as opposed to, well, why don't we understand that that's a result of something that's not being met as opposed to the cause of it. And sometimes, parents are told, well, if they weren't so oppositional, they'd be able to achieve this goal. It's like, no. If it's that difficult to achieve that goal, that means they're not getting properly supported, and that's where the oppositionality comes from. So I would bring in, I forgot Dr. Schultz's book. It's Nowhere to Hide, I believe is the name of Jerome Schultz's book.
I think so.
It's a great book. I would bring a book in like that. I would, show them this webinar, resources about how these emotional challenges are a result of it. I often find that even just putting it in sort of their terms, and not in a, wise way, but just more in a, let's take a step back and understand, we're all here. And if you came to work and, as a teacher, and you came to work and there was no chalk, for your blackboards, and there were no books, and the pencils weren't sharpened correctly, and, you had to walk a mile to get paper for your kid, that's going to you'll still be able to technically do your job, but at the end of the day, you're going to be more burnt. And then the next day you have to do it again. And the next day you have to do it again. And meanwhile, not only does that happen, but you might see other teachers that all their pencils are sharpened and they have access to paper and they have all the resources they need. And you're thinking, wait a minute, what's going on? Everyone else here seems to be getting what they need. And I often will translate that in ways just so we can all have an empathic picture of what this is like. And I tell parents basically to refuse that profile of, yes, my kid might be defiant, but that's not the cause of this. They're defiant because this is just simply too hard. It's just too much. This is their way of indicating to us that things are too much. They just don't have the vocabulary to say, well, my executive demands are overloaded right now and I'm being quite stressed. They're kids. Even adults have a hard time doing that. I work with adults who have burnout, very easily. So what we have to kind of gently push back and say, yes, I agree, they can be defiant, but that is not the cause of this. That is, to us, just data that we're not doing what we need to be doing to properly support him or her.
Mm-hmm. I love that. And we talk a lot at Understood about how we need to look at the behavior, like what is the function of that behavior? Why is this behavior coming out? And try to get to that root cause so that we can address that and hopefully avoid that behavior being necessary. Let's see. We have another question. We have lots of questions still coming in. We are running low on time, but I do want to get a couple more questions in. Okay, so this parent's asking, how do you handle a child that is a middle schooler who's already receiving an adapted curriculum, but isn't accepting that he needs to work more or harder to get the same results as his friends might who don't have dyslexia or a learning and attention issue?
Yeah, it's a great question. And it is something that absolutely is going to be part of the dialogue probably throughout their schooling. I mean, I feel like every year I have a similar discussion, with my son around it, just to see kind of how he's feeling about it and what that's like, because every year is going to bring different challenges. And one is to validate that frustration to them, saying, yes, that must be difficult to know that so-and-so, doesn't even hardly study, but, you can just read something in 5 minutes and get it and be off and doing whatever. That is really frustrating. And by doing that, it doesn't mean you're going to sort of make the issue worse or make your child feel like, it's not going to be misery loves company. It's more just a sense of validation, because what will definitely not work is if we, don't validate that, because then kids feel like they're not being understood. Secondly is to say, and again, I often think about who is the child and what kind of analogy would work best for them. So if I'm working with a child I'm a huge music person. So when I'm working with a fellow, musician or someone who's into music, I'm like, there are some albums that you can see interviews of that rock star, that composer that had to hammer out, an arrangement and a melody over and over and over and over and over and over again. And then look what happened. This sort of masterpiece happened, but they had to put the work in. If your child's an athlete, no one just runs a marathon by just waking up one morning, unless you're Forrest Gump, maybe, and saying, I'm just going to keep running, that you have to sort of train. But then once you do the proper training, then it doesn't have to be an issue. And I tell these kids, this does not have to be a lifelong obstacle for you, but we have to do the work now to not have it be a lifelong obstacle. We don't want this to be. This doesn't even have to be, an obstacle throughout all your education, perhaps, but we do have to put in that muscle now, in doing that. And it is frustrating and it is hard. And also as parents, I would reward your children, not unnecessarily, not in a way that spoils them, certainly, but in a way of acknowledging you do work really hard. And even just saying that every now and then to them, I really admire, my son has never had a summer since kindergarten where he has not had some kind of schooling, summer program, tutoring, something, because that summer, regression is even more significant for people with dyslexia. I recognize as a parent, if you had told me that every summer when I was his age that I would be doing, I would not have handled it as well as he has. So I have deep admiration for his ability to say, okay, if you're telling me this is what I need to do, I'm going to do it. But I also figure out ways of how do I reward that in a way of just saying you're doing a lot, and I understand and admire that, and that can go a long way.
Yeah, I like that. It's important to recognize that we are asking a lot of them and try to find those rewards to help continue that motivation.
Yes.
I have a question. So there's a couple questions from parents of older students in middle school and high school, and we get this question all the time. What about when kids are diagnosed later on in their education, and they're already suffering with a lot of negative self-esteem or low self-esteem because of they've had all of these issues and didn't get identified or diagnosed until later? How can parents kind of break that cycle of these kids feeling bad about themselves while they're figuring out how to help them academically?
Yes, and that happens very often because it's very easy, especially, you have a lot of students that are very, very bright who have found ways to compensate, perhaps, in first, second, third, fourth grade, but then eighth, ninth, 10th grade, the demands become so overwhelming that then that's when it's identified. So first and foremost, that's when I often make a promotion for therapy and having, just having someone, because we don't know the impact of all that negative scripting when someone has gone that long. We don't know. I work with kids who are in high school or college who were just diagnosed with dyslexia, and there's a lot to unpack in terms of how much of that negative scripting, even when they're elated around the diagnosis, saying, oh my gosh, this makes so much sense. Like, I wish I knew this. It doesn't necessarily just negate all of the hurts, all the I'm stupid times that they might have had to themselves throughout all of those years. So I definitely would highly recommend counseling therapy just to even just unpack a lot of that. Try to connect that person to other students that have dyslexia. If there is an advocacy group, we have an advocacy group in Massachusetts called Decoding Dyslexia. I know they have some chapters around, I don't know if there's one in every state, but a group like that connects families together, where you can meet somebody else who maybe also just got diagnosed in high school. Having that support is very, very important. And what's great with online things like this is that even if you're coming from a very small town where those resources are more limited, there's a whole bunch of them online of young people talking about. There are great TED Talks that my son actually showed me one the other day of this very young girl talking about her dyslexia, and a TED Talk was wonderful. So having that is really, really important. But I very, very much strongly advocate, if you can, some therapy. It could even be, every other week. It could be, but some way of just making sure that we're hitting all of that negative messaging. It's almost like a root canal. We want to kind of clean out all that negative messaging that might have been there and transpiring throughout all those years.
Mm-hmm. And with that note, I am going to squeeze in one last question that a parent was asking about counseling.
Yes.
Their son doesn't want to go to counseling. How do you recommend parents handle that? Is there a way to convince a kid, or is it okay to force them to go to counseling, or what should they do?
So I usually say, if there isn't a serious issue, so meaning that, you're not seeing school refusal, substance abuse, eating issues, self-harm, in that kind of way, I usually present it. I'll have parents say, you know what, why don't you just commit to just going once? Because I think a lot of times when kids hear therapy, they think, oh my gosh, I have to go every week. And, and you just say, just go once. But as parents, make sure you do your homework in finding the right personality and the right fit of the therapist, because that therapist is going to be very influential of how your child sees therapy. If they don't click with them, they're going to think all therapists are like that. So you might have to, I have parents who say, I just like to meet with you and I'm kind of therapist shopping. That's great. I think every parent should do that because every personality is different. Just commit to one, and then maybe couple it, like piggyback some sort of fun activity right afterwards. Like, right after that, then, there's a pizza place nearby and we could grab a pizza after. Sometimes that can sweeten the deal. A lot of kids are more open to it if they are like, okay, I'll just go once. And if that, therapist can, help them and feel sort of connected, they might be more willing to go maybe once a month. And I tell parents, I have had kids that have been in that position. Once a month they commit to, and that might be that. But in that once a month, we're getting a lot more done than if they never came to see me at all. And then sometimes what's great, or oftentimes, is that the child might say, oh, well, can I now go every other week? And then we go every other week, and then maybe it could be weekly. Now, when it's something serious in the mix, substance abuse problems, depression, suicidality, things like that, it does become less negotiable, because now the child's health and real physical health and mental health is at stake, and they may not be in a position to really make a decision to consent. Now, you can't physically drag them in, but to say, this is not working, we're very concerned about you, and so we're going to go, see someone. We don't know, again, I don't want you thinking that we're committing you to every week or whatnot. But this, you have to be straight with your child and saying, the writing is on the wall. If you haven't been to school in 2 months, and this could continue for years unless we really work at this. You're using drugs and alcohol to self-medicate. This could lead to you dying. I mean, this is how serious this is. And you sometimes have to be blunt, because they need to know why you're making such a big deal out of it, because it is a big deal in terms of their happiness, but also appeal to them and saying, this is not a punishment. This is really a way for you to just be open about saying anything, even if it's against us. Like, I have parents, which is great. The first session will sit and they'll frame it for their adolescent and saying, look, if you want to just vent about mom and dad the whole time, go ahead, like whatever you need to do, because we just want you happy. And that goes a long way with kids, because they're like, okay, even if I'm trash talking them, then then this could, they just want me to be happy. And of course, a therapist isn't going to just, we will hear what the child says, but then underneath all that, we hear a lot of the anxiety, the depression, those type of issues. But it may take, and also give your child some time. I mean, don't force it too much, at the beginning. Again, if there isn't a serious, concern at the beginning, but then revisit it maybe 2-3 months later. Or if you see some symptoms getting worse, to say, a year ago you were saying that things were okay, and now I notice you're sad more days than you're not. Now is the time for us to do this. So sometimes it's like you have to kind of plant a seed, and it could be sometimes a year later that they end up agreeing, but just keep gently at it. But if it's, again, more serious, you might even need to get, like, let's say their primary care physician on board, to another trusted adult other than the parent, to say, look, you really need this, as we care about you.
Oh, Roberto, this has been super helpful. And I know we ran over a little bit, so thanks for staying with us.
Absolutely.
We appreciate you being here so much.
My pleasure.
For our viewers out there, thanks for joining us. If you missed part of this webinar, we do record them and we upload them on the site. So you can find that recording later on today at u.org/calendar. And you can also find our upcoming expert chats and all of our previous ones as well. And if you have a question that didn't get answered today, or if more questions are coming up and you want to talk to other families, you can join our community, and sometimes our experts pop in there and answer questions as well. You can find that at u.org/community. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you.